As I continue our look through Peter's first epistle, what we know as First Peter in the Bible, we come to the second half of chapter 2, where we have a practical consideration of what holiness means. And so I've entitled my talk, Surprised by Holiness, and I'll be looking at 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 to 25. And here's a question to keep in mind. Do I practice holiness in order to bring a practical benefit to the world I touch? It's a thought-provoking question, and one that I think lies behind Peter's words that we look at today. In a society where the practice of one's faith is encouraged to be a private affair, holiness works to tear the cover off the privacy of our faith. I did not know who Dan Snyder was until he died from injuries he sustained in a single-vehicle car crash in which he was a passenger on September 29, 2003. At the time, Dan Snyder was a 25-year-old hockey player from Elmira, Ontario, who was playing for the Atlanta Thrashers in the NHL, the team which has since become the Winnipeg Jets. Even though the crash happened many years ago, there are details about it which have kept its memory alive for me. First, for someone with my interests, there was the car. The black Ferrari 360 Modena convertible, driven by fellow Atlanta Thrasher Danny Heatley, was split in two from the force of the impact. Danny Heatley was able to return to playing hockey, but the shadow of the fatal crash continued to follow him, which leads to the second memorable detail. Dan Snyder came from a Mennonite family who took their faith very seriously and openly expressed their forgiveness of Danny Heatley. Despite being charged with vehicular homicide, Danny Heatley avoided jail time largely because of the support Dan Snyder's family gave him. To this day, the Snyder family's response to the crash has remained the most gripping part of the story. As a sports writer at the time wrote, "I don't know the Snyder family, but I can tell you with certainty that they must be amazing people." An unexpected response to a horrible tragedy tore the cover off the privacy of a family's faith. A few weeks ago, we looked at 1 Peter 1, and I suggested that Peter invites us to envision holiness as an ethical foundation which governs the way we interact with our world. Inevitably, if we embrace the world from an ethical foundation of holiness, we are going to react in ways that appear surprising to other people. And just like Dan Snyder's family offer of forgiveness, our holiness benefits the world we touch. As we read this section in 1 Peter from chapter 2, verses 11 to 25, notice the ways in which a holy ethic positively impacts the world around us. This is what Peter wrote. "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, honor the emperor. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to sin and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. We are tempted to picture holy people as those mystical people who only commune with God, representing that old saying, people who are so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good. But according to Peter, holiness results in living out a positive alternative to popular culture. Peter's exact words were, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God. A powerful statement, but here's a tip. Don't ever call your neighbors pagans. Now, when Peter referred to his readers as foreigners and exiles, he wasn't calling them that in the spiritual sense of the old gospel song which says, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. Peter's readers physically lived in a hostile world in which they were seen as outsiders. But Peter also wanted them to understand that being outsiders didn't have to be a negative indictment. According to Peter, holiness means that it's our goodness which will identify us as outsiders. This is not the way we often view holiness. Holiness isn't meant to make us weird in the sense of wearing strange clothes and living in secluded compounds. Our holiness is meant to bring goodness to the world in which we live. The wonderful thing about that kind of practical holiness is that it has the potential to introduce an element of surprise into our world. It's like that sports writer who commented, I don't know the Snyder family, but I can tell you with certainty that they must be amazing people. The world can never have too much of the kind of holiness that offers the surprise of receiving forgiveness when it expected condemnation, of receiving caring compassion when it expected neglect. It's one thing to offer holy reactions to people within our local community. But what about our broader responses to the political landscape of which we are part? Peter challenged his readers to not isolate themselves from the politics of their time, but to instead be exemplary corporate citizens. Being good citizens required submission to governing authorities, which would in turn silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. In other words, holiness means that the part of the country you touch will be a better place because of you. Within the context of which Peter's readers lived, the thought that holiness results in being good citizens must have been particularly challenging. Unlike the situation in our country, there is no thought within the New Testament that the governments of the day would be anything but hostile toward the Christian community. The emperor to whom Peter referred was the horrible Nero. Nero was such a nasty fellow that he became symbolic of the Antichrist because of his terrible persecution of Christians. And yet, he was the one to whom the Bible challenged believers to submit, to be patriotic, we might say. Why would God ask his people to be patriotic to evil people? Well, it's because holiness is always lived out in a context of submission. First Peter has the uncomfortable distinction of making more references to submission than any other New Testament book. The hard truth we are meant to understand is that a person who is unwilling to be submissive cannot be holy. Does submission mean that a person should never challenge societal wrongs? No. But Peter reminds us to be respectful. I think the African American Senator John Lewis, who died this past July, got a lot of this right. Maybe I developed a soft spot for him because he had been ordained as a Baptist preacher when he was a young man. Being a black man from the southern state of Georgia, John Lewis knew all about social injustice, and he became a champion of what he called good trouble. John Lewis was committed to nonviolence, but was himself the recipient of violent attacks. Even though he led many protest marches during his life, when he died, he was remembered by people of various political persuasions as a man of peace. His life had silenced the ignorant talk of foolish folk. He left the legacy of making his country a better place. Why is submission such a big deal when it comes to holiness? It's simply this. Holiness produces a consistent pattern of self-denial, and that depends on submission. Self-denial is contrary to human nature because we're naturally more concerned about personal rights than we are about personal service. None of us likes to work in the background, and we are offended if no one notices what we do. Within the context of the day, Peter used slaves who were willing to suffer for doing good as an example of submissive self-denial. Slavery at that time wasn't based on racial lines. Education among slaves was encouraged. Slaves could have great responsibility. They could own property. They had religious freedom, and they were usually freed by age 30. That still didn't relieve them of being the lowest class of society, who were obligated to submit to their masters. Jesus, of course, was the ultimate example of submission and holiness because of his commitment to self-denial. Jesus is the proof that self-denial brings life to other people. From a practical point of view, we could say that There are two kinds of people in the world: those who focus on building themselves up, and those who focus on building other people up. The Bible's perspective is that holiness is a commitment to building up other people. People who dedicate themselves to holiness cannot help but bless the world they touch with a taste of goodness.